Star Wars Jedi Survivor has been patched, promising improved performance, reduced hitching, and presumably a better experience on PC. Is this true? Have EA and Respawn Entertainment actually managed to fix this utterly broken game on PC? Let us find out. Getting into the game, you will notice some differences right away. Shader pre-compilation now appears to work consistently as you would expect. Previously, this shader compilation step seemed bugged, as the shader compilation screen would show up for 30 seconds or more no matter what each time you started the game. With patch 9, I have only recorded shader compilation occurring the first time the game is booted or when a different driver is installed. It seems longer as well than it did earlier, so it is potentially capturing more shaders than it did in an earlier version of the game, but more on that later. This is good to see, as the game is now not wasting your time each time it starts up, like the previous version was. That bug appears to be fixed, but I have to unfortunately report that a lot of other bugs appear not to be fixed. For example, sometimes selecting DLSS does not actually engage DLSS at the chosen level. I started playing the game after the patch expecting the game to be running in DLSS performance mode, but it was running way slower than I expected and had a different visual output. Going into the menu, I tried changing that DLSS mode, and the performance was still not being affected no matter what I chose. I only got DLSS to actually engage by restarting the game. Similarly, the white occlusion culling flashing that plagues this game and many other Unreal Engine titles is still there, and it can be really bad in this game depending upon the environment you're in, like here in this meat locker where each time the camera's turning there are big flashes of culled away geometry and you can see the gray or white background behind them for a few frames. This definitely gives the game a less than stable look all throughout the experience. There are other visual bugs there too. For example, the area light bug that I experienced at launch is still in there in the current patch 9 version of the game, and I also experienced a new bug, like how after this cutscene ended, the game was set to the wrong field of view for a bit. It was all zoomed out. So patch 9 does fix certain things, I guess, but a lot of the bugs are still there, and a number of those are also still in the menu, like options not engaging when you want them to. This game still feels buggy more than a year after release, and even after this patch 9 update. Okay, so what about performances? That's really all I actually care about here. The patch notes mention a frame rate improvement for various hardware configurations, as well as fixes for several sources of frame rate hitching for smoother gameplay, and lastly, ray tracing has been optimized for CPU usage and should now scale better for higher end GPUs. This means potentially multiple different improvements, and let's go through them one by one. Let's talk about frame rate, here running across Kobo on the Ryzen 5 3600. Here I'm CPU limited, and I note an 8% average frame rate improvement on the low settings with no ray tracing on this CPU in this run. This is compared to the previous patch. That is okay, but nothing spectacular. On the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, as we see here, with no RT using the EPIC settings, I actually only measured a 3% frame rate improvement when CPU limited. So that's even less spectacular. Average frame rate improvements seem to benefit lesser cored, slower CPUs like the Ryzen 5 3600 here, at least on the Kobo stage. That is with ray tracing off. With ray tracing on, the gains are actually better in average frame rate. Running across Kobo with ray tracing on and EPIC settings on the Ryzen 5 3600 shows a 19% average FPS improvement over the previous patch, which is impressive. You can see similar improvements to performance on the Ryzen 7 7800X3D. For example, in this scene here on Coruscant, we can see a 13% performance win with ray tracing on there in patch 9 versus patch 8. The actual increase in performance, though, will depend upon what you're seeing on screen. Until patch 9, each time a hologram was on screen, it would absolutely tank performance, sometimes dropping performance by around 50% or more. This is improved in patch 9. In those scenes where a hologram will show up momentarily, the average frame rates in such moments can be 30% higher, as measured here on the Ryzen 7 7800X3D while CPU limited. So whatever the developers did here, they have lessened the strange burden that holograms have on the CPU. and as a result, they've significantly improved the frame rate in such sections of the game. Throughout the campaign though, with RT on, you'll most likely see around a 10 to 15% average FPS increase if you leverage that RT. That is nice to see, and I think it does go to show how unoptimized the game has been for such a long time, especially versus launch. Compared to launch, we can see a huge increase in performance on this Kobo run. As of patch 9, the game now runs 36% better when CPU limited on the Ryzen 5 3600 without ray tracing on, and if I had a recording with ray tracing on from launch day on the CPU, we would see even greater gains. So the game has healthily improved average frame rates since launch, and a lot due to patch 9. But what about frame times? I did accidentally call this game Judder Survivor after all. Here I have a lot to report on. The first is in Shader Compilation Stutter. It is now better than in patch 8. A good example is doing the first run on Kobo after reinstalling drivers. If I did that test under patch 8, as we can see here, there are more than 24 shader compilation stutters just running across this little section of Kobo while having a cold shader cache, as I'll call it. 24 in a 1 minute and 10-second recording of gameplay. That's a lot. With patch 9, that same test showcases only 4 shader compilation stutters on a cold shader cache. So the amount of shader compilation stutters that can potentially occur has measurably lessened, significantly so, especially in this Kobo area, but that doesn't mean they're all gone. They are still happening, they're just fewer and farther in between. They're more spaced out essentially. There are less shader compilation stutters than before as of patch 9. I find this commendable, but in 2024, I honestly have a no-nonsense policy about shader compilation stutter. There shouldn't be any, especially given the amount of time that this game has had since launch. But what about Traversal Stutter? Here the answer is more complex. Let us go back to Kobo with the Ryzen 5 3600, comparing patch 8 and 9. If you look at the orange line, which is patch 8 on the frame time graph, and compare it to the red one, which is patch 9, we can quite easily see that the overall size of the frame time spikes has been generally reduced. You can also notice that some areas where frame time spikes were occurring are now smoothed over, as the frame time spikes no longer exist in those areas. If you put the launch version, patch 8, and patch 9 all next to each other in sequential order, we can see easily that patch 8 had the same stutter locations during that Kobo run as on launch day. It was just they were lessened to some degree. Patch 9, on the other hand, actually manages to get rid of a number of them altogether. This is great to point out. But still, look at that patch 9 side there. There are a number of frame time spikes on a Ryzen 5 3600 still, even though we are on the lowest setting possible in the game without RT. With the Ryzen 7 7800 X3D, it's a very similar story. Comparing between patches, patch 8 and 9, we can see lessened frame time spike length, and some of the frame time spike locations are now completely smoothed over. But it is important to note, once again, just like on the Ryzen 5 3600, there are still frame time spikes there, and frame time spikes are still happening. The length of those frame time spikes on the Ryzen 7 7800 X3D without ray tracing can be anywhere between 16 or 33 milliseconds. Those would still be very visible with an unlocked frame rate, definitely. Unfortunately, with RT on, the situation is much less positive. Going back to the Ryzen 5 3600, the frame time graph with RT on between patches is honestly still disastrous. It is technically better than what it was before. The frame time spike lengths are shorter, but if you look at that frame time graph, it still looks extremely craggy. Nothing in that performance there would look visually smooth on any display out there. The story is the same with the Ryzen 7 7800 X3D. Here's me running around Kobo with ray tracing on. Due to patch 9, we are seeing less frame time spikes as a number of the traversal stutters have been removed, and depending upon the area you're in with ray tracing on, the frame times will go full Garbo mode, as I'll call it. Every few meters you'll see a big frame time spike where the frame time will double, triple, or quadruple over the base. This type of experience would never look smooth on any display out there. It just won't. So what about frame capping to help this out? Here, the effectiveness of frame capping to increased perceived smoothness is unfortunately more limited than in other games due to the animation issue I described in my last Jedi Survivor video. It is still present in patch 9. Basically, in all those areas where frame time spikes are occurring, they cause some sort of misfiring of the game's animation update, causing it to show the animation position incorrectly. This applies to character movement and camera movement. And the best way to show that off is to show the game off on a Ryzen 5 3600 with RT on. Here I've locked the game using triple buffered VSync to 30 FPS, but just running through Kobo looks disastrously unsmooth. Animations are skipping, and the camera covers an uneven distance all the time, making it look like it is stopping and starting constantly. If you look at the frame time graph, you would think this is technically smooth. But the animation system being tied to some sort of internal tick rate or CPU limit in the game is making all the animation unsmooth. This same behavior applies in a less intense way to the ultra high-end Ryzen 7 7800X3D with RT on. If you lock the frame rate down there to 60 FPS for example, it still shows inconsistent camera movement and animation movement in all those locations where frame time spikes are occurring behind the scenes. And it's doing that even though those frame time spikes may technically not be enough to break the frame rate locking. The game somehow just has an animation system which does this. That means the only hope you have for smoothness is having a high-end CPU and turning RT off and then locking down the frame rate to some value where you can't see this animation issue happening as often. That will be different for every single CPU tier out there. For example, a Ryzen 7 7800X3D can kind of manage 60 FPS smoothness with RT off, but you'll still see them happening occasionally here or there. Due to this animation behavior that the game has, I imagine the game will only start to look really smooth at 60 FPS when CPUs are 2 to 3 times more powerful than they already are today. And I find that a pretty embarrassing situation. And that is how I want to end this video. Patch 9 for Jedi Survivor does improve overall frame rate and frame times. That is commendable, but I also think it shows how broken the game has been up until patch 9. And unfortunately, patch 9 still cannot fix a game which I think is broken at some sort of fundamental level. The patch may improve things, but frame time hitches are still all over the place, especially with RT on. Just look at the frame time graph in this cutscene here. Patch 9 has improved the average frame rate in this scene, but the frame time stability, as we see in the bottom right, is still extremely poor. There's constant frame time spikes everywhere, all the time, and that makes the game look and feel inconsistent in motion. On top of those frame time spikes that the game still has all throughout the gameplay experience, we also have the same animation issue that I talked about in previous videos. That is not fixed by patch 9. For some reason, internal CPU spikes make the animation play back poorly in this game, even though the real frame rate target could be being met and be technically fine. Locked frame rates do not guarantee a smooth animation in this game. I find that very poor. We've now had a 1.5 year long journey to get where we are here with patch 9, and I would still say Jedi Survivor on PC is not good enough, and really not by a long shot. That is all. Like, subscribe, ring the bell, and this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.